let's have a look at the contents of each sub-competence as we explained them earlier on, based on the 2017 book by the group published by John Benjamin. So if we look at the bilingual sub-competence, what components are included in the bilingual sub-competence? Pragmatic, sociolinguistic, textual, grammatical, and lexical knowledge in the two languages. We need to know about grammar, we need to know about lexis, we need to know about how texts work, we need to know about different varieties of the language or language variation, the registers, formal, informal, dialects. Pragmatic, we need to make sure that we use the language according to or in accordance to the situation. That's what pragmatics does, to understand how language is used in context to enable communication. So if we look at pragmatic knowledge, we find the following two aspects. Knowledge of the pragmatic conventions needed to carry out language acts acceptable in a given context. And then this pragmatic knowledge makes it possible for us to use language to express and understand linguistic functions and speech acts. So if we really want to appeal to the target language, we will use language in an appellative way. If we want to inform, we will include information. This is the pragmatic dimension. If we continue with the bilingual sub-competence, remember that we had a sociolinguistic knowledge. We need to make sure that we use language according to conventions, expectations, rules, custom. When it comes to using language for language acts that are going to be acceptable in a context, we need to use language registers accordingly, we need to use dialects accordingly as well, and this is the sociolinguistic knowledge included in the bilingual sub-competence in the transition competence model. Then we also need to know about texts. Remember, we deal with texts. Translators translate text, not languages. So we need to make sure that we know about texture. When I talk about texture or we refer to texture, we're talking about coherence and cohesion. How texts work, how texts are held together by the use of certain mechanisms. We need to know and master those in both languages. And we also need to be aware of the different conventions, the different rules and different expectations with involving the use of different textual genres in order to use texts effectively. So this is the bilingual. If we move on to the extralinguistic sub-competence, remember our knowledge of the world, we have the bicultural knowledge. We need to know about both cultures, the source and target cultures. We need to have what the Pacte group called encyclopedic knowledge, knowledge about the world in general. We need to have a good we need to be well read. Translators need to be well read. And finally, we also need a subject knowledge. We need to know about the subject matter that the texts we are dealing with is framed or are framed. So we need to know about medicine, law, economics, etc. So we need that field-specific knowledge in order to translate specific or specialized text. If we continue to the knowledge of translation, that sub-competence that has to do with how translation works, the different aspects of the translation process, what translation units we're dealing with, what different methods and strategies and procedures we have at our fingertips to apply, what types of problems are we going to be finding. We need to know about translation technically, about what's involved in translation. And then in the second level, within the knowledge of translation sub-competence category, we need to know about the work market, we need to know about the profession, the ethics of the profession, how to calculate fees and prices, how to read a translation brief and apply it, how to respond to the needs of target audiences. This is the knowledge of translation. We need to know about the profession as such. And then we have the instrumental sub-competence. Remember, the knowledge related to the use of certain components, for instance, documentation. How do we use technologies applied to translation? How do we use dictionaries? How do we use encyclopedias? How do we use grammars, reference books, style books, parallel texts? Those are, as you remember, examples of texts written in the same subject matter, so we can get an idea of the basic physiology, style, even find terminology that we need. The use of electronic corpora, the use of search engines, in sum, all the resources that we have at our disposal. But we have the strategies of competence, very important of competence. If you remember, the function of this competence is to help us plan the process and execute the process of translation or any transition project, to match the appropriate method with the specifications of the project, and being able to evaluate the process as we go and compare it to the final purpose to make sure that they match, or to the scopus, as we would say in the course, to activate different subcompetencies and compensate for any shortcomings that we may find in them. So this holds together, this strategic competence holds together all the competencies in the model. Also, to be able to identify transition problems as we see them. Otherwise, we'll have two problems. If we have a problem and we don't identify it, we have two, don't we? So we need to be able to identify problems, and this strategic competence allows us to do that and apply the procedures that we need to solve these problems. And finally, the psychophysiological components, or they used to call it competence, but they have decided to change to two components, because they are not really, some of them are not really skills or competencies, but they are attributes. The cognitive components, memory, perception, attention, emotion, the attitudinal, attitude-related aspects, like intellectual curiosity or perseverance, rigor. So these are the dispositions that a translator would have, or would have to develop and acquire in order to engage in translation with some success. And finally, abilities that translators tend to have, like the ability to reason logically, to be creative within the parameters of the source message, analysis and synthesis, or analytical, synthetical skills. So all these constitute what the psychological components of translation. So let's do a little quiz. Let's see if we can connect the subcompetencies and the contents more in detail. So if I add this bicultural knowledge about the source and target cultures, which one would it be? This is an example. We could be bilingual subcompetence, or B, extralinguistic subcompetence, or C, instrumental subcompetence. Well, as you remember from your notes, bicultural knowledge of the source and target cultures falls within or under the extra-linguistic subcompetence. Let's see the next ones. Different genres with their respective conventions, like structure, language features, etc. We have A, bilingual subcompetence, B, extra-linguistic subcompetence, C, instrumental subcompetence. Pause the video and ponder for a second which one of these would be the appropriate answer to match the prompt. Yes, it's bilingual subcompetence. These are the textual elements, the textual knowledge that's required of translators in the bilingual subcompetence. It has to do with languages and the mastery of the languages. Very good. So let's continue. Knowledge related to the use of documentation resources and information communication technologies applied to translation dictionaries of all kinds. Which one would it be? Would it be bilingual subcompetence, extra-linguistic subcompetence, or instrumental subcompetence? Pause the video and decide A, B, or C. That's correct. Instrumental subcompetence. This subcompetence allows the translator to use resources available to her in the best way possible. Let's see. What about to identify translation problems and apply procedures to solve these problems? Would you say this is the strategic subcompetence, or would this content refer to psychophysiological components, or perhaps knowledge of translation subcompetence? Pause the video and identify the correct answer. Yes, that's strategic subcompetence. Identifying translation problems and applying procedures to solve them falls under the umbrella of the strategic subcompetence. I think I have a couple more. Abilities such as creativity, logical reasoning, analysis, and synthesis. Which one do you think would be? Strategic subcompetence, psychophysiological components, knowledge of translation subcompetence? Pause the video and choose the right answer. That's correct. Psychophysiological components, some of the attributes needed by translators in order to engage successfully in the translation.